that major events, the kind that dictate the course of American politics, are all fake and engineered. But then the news that broke yesterday was as close to a total vindication as you'll ever get. On the other hand, if you thought that color revolutions only happen overseas and that America is immune from successful campaigns of mass deception, all orchestrated by corrupt political actors to mimic natural grassroots events, then this is a story that you need to hear. The Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, was supposedly the defining moment of Donald Trump's first term in office. That's what we were told relentlessly for years on end by both political parties, along with every mainstream media outlet in the country. It was a mask-off moment in which neo-Nazis, emboldened by Donald Trump, supposedly, violently rioted in the streets, killing an innocent woman in the process. And we were told Donald Trump endorsed these neo-Nazis live on national television, calling them very fine people. That's what Joe Biden said when he launched his campaign for president, and about 10 million times after that. The rally was definitive proof that white supremacy was alive and well in the United States. Watch.
Charlottesville is also home to a defining moment for this nation in the last few years. It was there on August of 2017 we saw Klansmen and white supremacists and neo-Nazis come out in the open. Their crazed faces, illuminated by torches, veins bulging and bearing the fangs of racism, chanting the same anti-Semitic bile heard across Europe in the 30s. And they were met by a courageous group of Americans, and a violent clash ensued. And a brave young woman lost her life. And that's when we heard the words of the President of the United States that stunned the world and shocked the conscience of this nation. He said there were, quote, some very fine people on both sides. Very fine people on both sides? With those words, the President of the United States assigned a moral equivalence between those spreading hate and those with the courage to stand against it.
Well, all of corporate America lined up to push this message. Shortly after the Unite the Right rally, Apple announced a $2 million donation to so-called anti-hate groups, including SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center. The CEO, Tim Cook, declared that hate is a cancer, and left unchecked, it destroys everything in its path. JP Morgan Chase and the Clooney Foundation did the same thing. In fact, JP Morgan's CEO, Jamie Dimon, said that the company would match employee donations to the SPLC. He also disbanded an advisory panel to the president for reasons that were never clear. But the SPLC got exactly what it wanted. They isolated the president, they demonized conservatives, and they received millions of donations. And they never stopped. They kept hammering the Unite the Right narrative, and they kept fundraising off of it successfully. In fact, 5 days before Charlottesville, Cam Higby reports that SPLC received $375,000 from the state of Alabama. So this is an extremely well-funded group with money coming from everybody, including the taxpayers, apparently. And this continued for years. The left was obsessed with Charlottesville, as you probably remember. It's the hoax that simply never died. You can make the case that it lasted longer than Russiagate. 4 years after Biden's campaign video in 2024, Kamala Harris again invoked Charlottesville on the debate stage. Watch.
Let's remember Charlottesville, where there was a mob of people carrying tiki torches, spewing anti-Semitic hate. And what did the president then at the time say? There were fine people on each side.
Now, every single aspect of this narrative, as told by every media outlet and by every prominent politician in Washington, was a lie. We've known that for some time. Trump did not endorse white supremacy. In fact, he explicitly did the opposite. And contrary to what CNN would have you believe, you don't have to be a neo-Nazi to oppose the removal of Robert E. Lee's statue. You simply have to be an American, someone who's interested in preserving our shared history and venerating our national heroes, of which Robert E. Lee is one of them, rather than defaming them. And that describes most of the people who attended that rally. And on top of that, you weren't told the full story about the woman who died during this rally. You were led to believe that Heather Heyer was murdered in cold blood by a white supremacist who drove into a crowd on purpose. But that's not what the authorities believed at first, before the mob demanded vengeance. Police officers actually thought the incident was not malicious at all, based on the fact that the driver was visibly horrified that somebody had died, the fact that his car had been surrounded and struck by an object, and the fact that the man had just Googled directions to his home, not the place where the attack happened. In other words, he was not a domestic terrorist. It looked a lot like he got lost and panicked after he was surrounded on his way home. Now, these are points that over the past decade, various conservative commentators have made or tried to make, but they've never really resonated, in part because many Republican politicians accepted the left's narrative on Unite the Right. It's also because, as we all know from experience, it's not easy to compete with a full-on hoax once it gets going. Propagandists who are willing to lie over and over again, no matter how flagrantly they do it, are usually pretty convincing. Now, the average person doesn't have time to fact-check every detail or do independent research. So when Ted Cruz claimed that an act of domestic terrorism had taken place in Charlottesville, most people were inclined to agree. But there was one aspect of the rally that, to give left-wing activists some credit, was difficult for conservatives to explain away. There were indeed photographs of several men at the Unite the Right rally, some of them carrying Nazi flags, and a couple of them yelled, "Jews will not replace us," which was considered offensive to leftists until about 15 minutes ago. And it was difficult for some conservatives, in the face of that photographic and video evidence, to deny that at some level, this rally was organized, or at least popular with, a group of neo-Nazis on the right. Now, of course, the appropriate response, even if that were true, would be to just ignore the outrage, The presence of a small number of people waving Nazi flags is not a national crisis, even if they're genuine Nazis. We're a country of more than 340 million people. If we're going to allow 5 guys with Nazi flags to derail our entire political discourse, then we're never going to accomplish anything. We're also going to create an enormous incentive for the left to wave Nazi flags around and blame them on the right, which it appears is exactly what happened. There's now very good reason to believe that at Charlottesville, what we saw was the product of a deliberate, engineered effort to destroy the image of Donald Trump and the Republican Party. Again, back in 2017, a claim like that would seem pretty far-fetched to most people. After all, what are the odds that a well-funded left-wing group aligned with the Democrat Party would actually pay people to act like Nazis at this small rally in Charlottesville, Virginia? What are the odds that actually the entire event was a psyop engineered from the beginning to give Democrats a pretext to wage war against quote-unquote white supremacy, which of course actually means white people and conservatism in general? Well, the odds were pretty good, as it turns out. Last night, the DOJ released an indictment alleging that the Southern Poverty Law Center, or SPLC, funded and supported an individual who was closely involved in coordinating the Unite the Right rally. And not only that, SPLC was funding, directly or indirectly, a lot of other supposedly right-wing extremism, including the KKK. Yes, according to the DOJ, the SPLC, the left's preferred anti-hate group, was allegedly paying affiliates of the KKK. Watch.
According to the indictment, between 2014 and 2023, SPLC paid at least $3 million to 8 individuals at least. These individuals were affiliated with the Ku Klux Klan, United Klans of America, National Socialist Movement, Aryan Nations Affiliated Sadistic Souls Motorcycle Club, the Nationalist Socialist Party of America, Nazis, and the American Front. Now, as the indictment lays out, after SPLC paid members of these extremist groups, it created work product that reported on these activities that the members participated in or contributed to. And to that end, it was doing the exact opposite of what it's told its donors it was doing. Not dismantling extremism, but funding it. To carry out this scheme, SPLC created bank accounts in the name of at least 5 completely fictitious organizations that had no bona fide employees or legitimate business purpose. The money was passed from SPLC to one sham account to a second sham account and then loaded onto prepaid cards to give to the members of the extremist groups.
Now, before we go into the specifics of the indictment, if you're not familiar with the SPLC, they're one of the most dishonest and dangerous left-wing organizations in the entire country. They exist to provide a pretext for the censorship and harassment of conservatives with the goal of destroying their lives. They also hate Americans, especially white Americans. But take a look at this video featuring Mark Potok, who worked with the SPLC at the time. And on the wall, you may notice a handwritten note documenting the decline of America's non-Hispanic white population. Watch.
And my bosses insisted that we move out of the house for a week. You know, at one point I was notified last year by a letter from a federal court in New York State that a certain guy.
So they zoom in really close on the numbers there. White people accounted for 90% of the population in 1920, only 62% in 2015. To the SPLC, this is a big victory. They're one of the main engines of demographic replacement in the country. Their goal is to demonize white people and claim that white supremacy is the greatest domestic terror threat for the purpose of eliminating, or at least greatly diminishing, the white population. Now, to give just one example of how they operate, the SPLC put Turning Point USA on their hate group list shortly before Charlie Kirk was murdered. And here's what Charlie wrote at the time in May of last year, quote, "The SPLC has added Turning Point to their ridiculous hate group list right next to the KKK and neo-Nazis. Even former staffers called their racket a con. Their game plan? Scare financial institutions into debanking us, pressure schools to cancel us, and demonize us so some unhinged lunatic feels justified targeting us. Remember the Family Research Council? An SPLC-inspired gunman went after them. They love nothing more than to see TPUSA in the crosshairs. Maybe someone should take a hard look at where all the nonprofit money is really going." Well, now we're finally discovering where the money went. Charlie also went on Fox to report that SPLC had targeted specific Turning Point chapters on college campuses. Watch.
Understand that they're literally putting high school chapters of ours on a hate group next to the KKK and next to neo-Nazi groups. And I mean, we can laugh this off. There's an element to this. Remember that there was a shooter that went to the Family Research Council years ago, inspired by the SPLC list. This is them trying to make us basically surrender at Turning Point USA. We're going to do the opposite, and our students are only going to lean in even more. But they can't debate us on our ideas. They cannot have dialogue. They cannot actually go onto the merits of why they are right or why we might be wrong. Instead, they must smear us with the age-old one-liner that you are a racist or that you are a hater.
Now, in addition to the Family Research Council, which Charlie mentioned, the SPLC has also defamed the Federalist Society, PragerU, the Heritage Foundation, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, the Foundation to Abolish Abortion, and so on and so on. They've targeted me as well in their effort to demonetize my channel and get me fired or killed. You can take a look at my profile. I have a whole profile on their website, which you can see right there. I'm listed under general hate and anti-LGBTQ. And at first, I admit, I was a little offended. I mean, if you're going to claim I'm a hateful person, then you should be able to point out specifically how I'm hateful, what I'm hateful towards. But if you say someone is just generally hateful, you're painting a broad brush, one that I would argue is pretty unfair under the circumstances. I mean, give me some credit here. My hatred is actually pretty specific. It's pretty specialized, specific hatred. But then a few people pointed out that general hate might actually be my rank. So if I'm general hate, that would put me above, major hate, lieutenant colonel hate, in which case I rescind my complaint and I gladly accept this prestigious title from the SPLC. In fact, I may need to add it to my bio next to theocratic fascist and children's author. But in any event, this is a direct quote from the DOJ's indictment concerning the Southern Poverty Law Center. The indictment refers to a number of Fs, which is short for field sources. Quote, between at least 2014 and 2023, the SPLC paid their Fs in a clandestine manner. Doing so hid the fact that while the SPLC received donation money under the auspices that the funds would be used to dismantle violent extremist groups, this donation money was instead being used in part by the SPLC to pay leaders and others within these same violent extremist groups. That money was then used for the benefit of the individuals as well as the violent extremist groups. Between 2014 and 2023, the SPLC secretly funneled more than $3 million in SPLC funds to Fs who were associated with various violent extremist groups. Examples of Fs who were secretly paid by the SPLC include, but are not limited to, the following. F37 was a member of the online leadership chat that planned the 2017 Unite the Right event in Charlottesville, Virginia, and attended the event at the direction of the SPLC. F37 made racist postings under the supervision of the SPLC and helped coordinate transportation to the event for several attendees. Between 2015 and 2023, the SPLC secretly paid F37 more than $270,000. So yes, according to this indictment, the SPLC paid more than $250,000 to one person who coordinated the Unite the Right rally and made racist posts under SPLC's supervision. That's a small fraction of the $3 million the SPLC has allegedly paid to fund various extremists in other groups. What this means is that if the DOJ's indictment is accurate, the SPLC is probably the single greatest funder of white supremacy, quote unquote, in the entire country. I mean, no one else is paying this kind of money to fund white nationalist rallies, which is why the SPLC had to do it themselves. Now, what needs to be emphasized here is that fundamentally the SPLC is not some random one-off left-wing activist group. They are a wing of the Democrat Party in charge of engineering domestic color revolutions with fraudulent narratives that they invent out of thin air for the purpose of overthrowing conservative administrations and replacing them with leftists. And then once the leftists are in charge, SPLC starts writing memos, which the FBI uses to justify violent crackdowns on conservatives. For example, a couple of years ago, the FBI field office in Richmond declared that Catholics were a domestic terror threat. Here's what the FBI wrote, quote, FBI Richmond assesses the increasingly observed interest of racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists in radical traditionalist Catholic, RTC, ideology almost certainly presents opportunities for threat mitigation through the exploration of new avenues for tripwire and source development. As of 2021, the Southern Poverty Law Center identified 9 RTC hate groups operating in the United States. So you see how this works. Very similar to Russiagate, the FBI's allies in a left-wing group write some memo, then the FBI will cite that memo as if it's an independent justification to launch an investigation. Meanwhile, inside the FBI, agents were writing their own emails about how insane this was, that the SPLC is dictating the FBI's activities. Here's one of those emails where FBI employees react to the designation of some Catholics as a hate group at the behest of the SPLC. One FBI employee writes, quote, that is interesting, several thoughts, but mostly, who is the customer? Is anyone really asking for a product like this? Apparently, we are at the behest of the SPLC. And then an agent replies, yeah, our over-reliance on the SPLC for hate designations is problematic. But the rank-and-file agents don't have any power. The people running the government, the Biden administration at the time, knew that the SPLC was manufacturing hate groups. That was the whole point. The more hate groups the left could manufacture, the easier it would be for Joe Biden to take the stage in front of a blood-red background, flanked by Marines, and declare that Republicans represent a threat to the Republic. Watch.
Too much of what's happening in our country today is not normal. Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans represent an extremism that threatens the very foundations of our republic.
Now, this bizarre, ominous speech laid the groundwork for the FBI's attacks on religious liberty, including pre-dawn SWAT team raids on peaceful pro-life demonstrators. It also laid the groundwork for the campaign of lawfare against Donald Trump, which had no precedent in American history. People are more willing to accept an authoritarian takeover when you convince them that their opponents are really domestic terrorists. This is why Biden and Merrick Garland declared that white supremacy was the greatest domestic terror threat facing the country. All of their messaging was directly in sync with the SPLC because they were getting it from the SPLC. And that's why, according to the DOJ, the SPLC's efforts went far beyond the Unite the Right rally. This is also from the DOJ's indictment about another field source for the SPLC. Quote, F9 was affiliated with the neo-Nazi organization, the National Alliance, and served as an F for the SPLC for more than 20 years. F9's activities included fundraising for the National Alliance. Between 2014 and 2023, the SPLC secretly paid F9 more than $1 million. So if we're following this allegation, the SPLC paid $1 million to somebody who was affiliated with a neo-Nazi organization. And then this informant, in turn, raised money for the neo-Nazi organization. So according to this indictment, the SPLC was going out of its way to ensure that a neo-Nazi group remained in existence. At the same time, they were calling for the eradication of right-wing hate, but they were actually doing everything in their power to fund neo-Nazis. And it was clear why they wanted to do that. Take a look at this screenshot from the SPLC's website. The caption reads, the Department of Homeland Security posted this image with the caption, "Which Way, American Man?" in August 2025. The caption appears to be a reference to a white nationalist book published by the National Alliance, a neo-Nazi hate group. So again, you see how this works. The SPLC wants groups like the National Alliance to exist so that they can accuse the Trump administration of associating with them. Meanwhile, the SPLC doesn't tell you that in secret, they're not simply associating with these groups, they are funding them. And according to the indictment, this happened all the time. Quote, the SPLC funneled more than $160,000 from a fictitious entity to F11, who then sent funds to various violent extremist groups, leaders, including the former Grand Wizard of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, it's the kind of strategy that's effective because unless you're extremely familiar with how depraved left-wing activists are, it would never occur to you that they're doing any of this. But they feel a need to do it because otherwise there would be no right-wing hate groups. If the SPLC did not fund them, they would not exist. And then Democrats would lose power and the SPLC would run out of money. Now, it's the same reason that your antivirus software bugs you all the time. If your antivirus software told you the truth, which is that you really don't need to pay for antivirus software anymore, then obviously nobody would subscribe. So instead, they pester you with fake threats and scare tactics. And it's kind of the same principle, except in the case of the SPLC, they were having a substantial effect on American politics. Now, the more you read this indictment, the more you realize how shameless it was. According to the DOJ, the SPLC was paying the same Klan members that it was complaining about by name on its website. Quote, F Unknown was the Imperial Wizard of the United Clans of America. In an article published on November 22nd, 2013, the SPLC described the group as a millennial reboot of what was once a serious domestic threat. F30 led the National Socialist Party of America, was the former director of a faction of the Aryan Nations, and a former member of the Ku Klux Klan. The SPLC website contained an extremist file webpage for F30 from which the SPLC solicited donations. Between 2014 and 2016, the SPLC secretly paid F30 more than $70,000. This overlapped the time period in which F30 was featured on the SPLC's extremist file webpage. Now, this appears to be that webpage from the SPLC. As you can see, they characterize the guy as a neo-Nazi, and meanwhile, they're paying him tens of thousands of dollars. So I got to say, as an aside, I'm starting to get a little frustrated because, again, I was also listed on their website of extremists. They put me on the list. They had my photo up and everything, and I was on their hate map as somebody who absolutely must be stopped. And yet, for all of this, I wasn't paid a single cent at any point. I served as general hate without any compensation whatsoever. Meanwhile, the KKK wizards were just like raking it in. If nothing else, I'll say this whole situation gives me newfound respect for Jussie Smollett because he really kind of bootstrapped his fake hate crime and paid for it himself rather than having SPLC organize and fund it for him. He didn't need SPLC money any more than I did. So, there's a lesson there. Support your local mom and pop hate crime hoax operations. You got to do it now before they're all put out of business by, the big guys like SPLC. Now, of course, all kidding aside, SPLC was not offering money to genuine conservatives who are effective at advancing conservatism. The idea was to fund and prop up the alleged right-wingers who were useful to SPLC and the left. And I suspect that soon, whether through this investigation or those to come, we're gonna find out that there are a fair number of alleged conservative figures, the most embarrassing and ridiculous ones, who've been getting paid by the forces they pretend to oppose. There's a symbiotic relationship between left-wing activist groups and the supposedly right-wing grifters. And this relationship has always been obvious. Now we're learning about its financial dimensions. Speaking of which, back to the KKK, what exactly were they doing to get all the SPLC money? Well, here's one example. It turns out that about a decade ago, there was a big controversy in Georgia over something called the Adopt a Highway program. The idea is that if you're an organization, you can adopt a section of the state highway system if you agree to pick up garbage along the side of the highway. In exchange for picking up the trash, you get to have your group's name posted on signs alongside the stretch of the highway that you have adopted. There was a similar program in Missouri for a while, which led to the creation of this sign along the highway. And eventually the sign was taken down, apparently because the KKK didn't pick up enough trash. But in any event, you can see why the KKK would want this kind of visibility. It's basically free advertising from the government. And apparently SPLC was a big fan of that advertising as well. This is from the indictment, quote, F43 was the reported national president of American Front and a convicted federal felon for participation in a cross burning. Between 2016 and 2019, the SPLC secretly paid F43 more than $19,000. F Unknown was a member of the Ku Klux Klan and married to an exalted cyclops of the Ku Klux Klan. F Unknown and their spouse were involved in litigation whereby the Ku Klux Klan applied to take part in the Adopt a Highway program. During the course of litigation, known payments were traced from the SPLC to F Unknown, which exceeded $3,500. Now, it's not exactly clear what that money bought, but it sounds like the SPLC was all in favor of the KKK getting a stretch of the highway named after them. This is how pro-white supremacy the SPLC is. I mean, they're all in. They won't stop until every stretch of highway in the country is named after a KKK Grand Wizard. We're going to run out of Grand Wizards soon enough. I don't know how many there have been. That's the extent of their commitment to anti-racism. As Ibram X. Kendi, aka Henry Rogers, once said, the only way to combat racism is to be as racist as possible. And the SPLC, more than any other organization on the planet, has definitely taken that advice to heart. Now, the rest of the indictment outlines the ways in which the SPLC allegedly laundered money through shell companies to these various informants. Now, the SPLC allegedly set up fake companies like the Center Investigative Agency, or CIA, as well as Fox Photography, Northwest Technologies, the Tech Writers Group, and a rare books warehouse. The idea is that, for obvious reasons, the SPLC didn't want to cut checks from their own account, so they may have broken the law by creating a bunch of fake companies to send the wire transfers. And in addition to that, DOJ is claiming that donors were basically defrauded because they were donating with the expectation that they were fighting right-wing extremism, not funding it. This is obviously an ongoing case, and the SPLC is claiming that it was simply paying informants to undermine these groups. And already, Democrats, including Hakeem Jeffries, are claiming that the Trump administration is weaponizing the DOJ to go after its political opponents, which, of course, is something Democrats would never do. For their part, the Democrats' allies in the media are mostly ignoring the story. Newsbusters reports that, quote, ABC, CBS, and NBC all bit their tongues rather than report on the downfall of the self-proclaimed anti-hate group. In fact, only PBS reported on the indictment, but PBS's report on the indictment was vague and unclear. The charges were cited but not explained. The SPLC's CEO was allowed in for a friendly soundbite. Well, imagine that. After years of talking nonstop about Charlottesville, none of the mainstream media outlets are going to talk about SPLC's role in helping organize that rally. After decades of citing the SPLC as a credible source of information on so-called hate groups, none of them are going to talk about the federal allegations that the company was funding those same groups. Apparently, they're going to, they're going with the argument from the Democrat Party, which is that, well, the SPLC was simply using informants for legitimate purposes. And meanwhile, something called the Jewish Council for Public Affairs just released a bizarre statement defending SPLC, saying they do valuable work to counter violent extremism, never mind the fact that they fund it. Now, these arguments, of course, amount to complete BS. When you're paying millions of dollars, you're not buying informants, you're supporting the organizations themselves and propping them up. It's obvious what the game was. SPLC funded right-wing extremist groups so that it could turn around and fundraise off of them and use them as a pretext to crack down on conservatives nationwide. That's what was happening. But the thing is that even if these excuses were true, that they were just paying informants as part of an investigation or whatever, it would just serve to underscore the degree to which the left has created quasi-governmental agencies despite having no legal authority to do so. The SPLC, according to their own defense, was basically acting like the FBI, hiring undercover agents to disrupt terrorism and so on. They have no authority to do that. They're not a law enforcement agency. It's hard to ignore the fact that based on this indictment, we've been living under the tyranny, not just of unelected judges and unelected bureaucrats, but also unelected activist organizations that have been empowered to act as government, as agents of the government. Now, I've been beating this drum for a while now about the need for the Trump administration to go to war with these fake nonprofits and NGOs that in reality are criminal front groups for the Democrat Party. And with this indictment, more than a half a year after the murder of Charlie Kirk, the Trump administration is finally getting serious about doing that. And that's genuinely worth applauding. I have plenty of criticisms about this administration, which I have voiced many times and will continue to. But if they can dismantle these cancerous left-wing front groups, the same way they closed down the border and shut down the fraudulent asylum claims, then unequivocally, this administration will have been a success. It certainly would be a lot better than what the alternative would have been. And as tempting as it might be to engage in doomerism and to complain nonstop, we do need to celebrate wins when they happen. We need to recognize this indictment is a sign of major progress, and it needs to continue. And we also need to understand at the same time that SPLC is just the tip of the iceberg. The SPLC, as alleged, is a criminal organization. Every leftist activist group is just as corrupt and dishonest and sinister as this. They all want you dead. They all have no problem using hoaxes and psyops to get what they want. They all celebrated what happened to Charlie Kirk. They're all willing to go to extraordinary lengths unfathomable to sane people, to defame, harass, and destroy their opponents. So it's not crazy to wonder who, for instance, was actually behind January 6th. I mean, if they're willing to spend millions of dollars on false flag operations for the purpose of generating a narrative that they can use to demonize and jail their political opponents for several years and also fundraise off of, then it's not exactly a stretch to conclude that January 6th was probably just like Charlottesville, a well-funded psyop. It's not exactly unheard of. Something similar to this incident happened back in 2001 in Germany. The federal government wanted to ban the National Democratic Party of Germany, saying they were run by the Nazis. But the plan fell apart when it emerged that, in fact, confidential informants of German intelligence agencies were active in the leadership of the party. Intelligence agencies and activist groups have never stopped running this playbook. During the Canadian trucker convoy, some mysterious Nazi flags appeared, and the people holding them eventually went back to a hotel that was being used by Canada's federal police. So these kinds of psyops are extremely common. But if you say any of this out loud, they'll come after you relentlessly. They bankrupted Alex Jones and stole his company, not because of anything he said about a school shooting, but because he made observations like this about Charlottesville.
Charlottesville was mainly a bunch of homosexual leftists dressing up like Nazis who'd all formerly worked for Obama or Hillary, part of their art club, and then they lured a bunch of reporters there and some real white supremacists so the police could stand down and collide them into the folks. I pointed out that some of the same leftist foundations are funding the white supremacists that are funding real white supremacists in Ukraine. I got sued for that, even though it's, they try to say that I said some cameraman killed the girl. I didn't say that the cameraman killed them. I said it was all part of leftists coming out to come to this big event, hope there was some big crisis out of it to demonize the right in general and tie us to Nazis.
So it turns out that was exactly correct. I mean, he was 100% right. He saw through it at the time, and they destroyed him for it. The press, the NGOs, the nonprofits all denounced him and made sure he lost everything. That's what happened to a lot of people. And now, lawfully, and without any apologies whatsoever, we have no choice but to do the same to them. That'll do it for the show today. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Talk to you tomorrow. Have a great day. Godspeed.